Picture this. You're at the dinner table with your adult child. Maybe it's a holiday. Maybe it's just a Sunday. And somewhere in the middle of the meal, you say something ordinary, something you meant kindly, and they respond with a tone that stops you cold. It's not what they said. It's how they said it. The impatience. The edge. The slight roll of the eyes before they look back at their phone. And in that moment, something in your chest tightens. Not quite anger, not quite sadness, but something in between. A kind of disorientation. This is my child. I raised this person. If you've lived that moment, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you probably also know the silence that comes after, the way you swallowed it, told yourself it was nothing, maybe even apologized without fully knowing why. I've spent more than 4 decades as a psychologist working with families. I have sat with parents in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, parents who sacrificed enormously, who gave and gave and gave, and who came to me quietly devastated by the way their adult children spoke to them. Not in dramatic, headline-making ways. In the small, daily ways. The dismissive tone. The interrupted sentence. The eye roll that says, "You don't really matter here. And here is the most important thing I want you to hear before we go any further. This is not about your children being bad people. And it is not about you having failed as a parent. What it is about is a dynamic, a pattern, a set of unspoken rules that developed slowly, over years, that both of you are now living inside of, probably without either of you realizing it. And here is the good news. Dynamics can be changed. Not through confrontation. Not through guilt. Not through a tearful conversation that you've probably already had more than once without it changing anything. They change through mastery. Through 5 specific internal competencies that, once developed, alter the entire gravitational field of the relationship. That is what today's video is about. Before we get into the 5 things, I want to acknowledge something. Most of you watching this were raised with a very specific understanding of how respect works. You earned it. You modeled it. You showed up, to work, to family, to obligation, and the expectation was that consistency, sacrifice, and presence would be recognized, would be honored. That was the contract. And for most of your parents, it worked. But somewhere between your generation and your children's, the cultural contract changed. Your adult children grew up in a world that gave them a language for their needs, their boundaries, their emotional experiences, and that is not entirely a bad thing. But it created a gap. Because nobody gave that same generation the language to also honor what their parents carry. What you carry. So you find yourself holding an old map in a changed landscape. And the strategies that should work, the quiet endurance, the loyalty, the sacrifice, they're not producing the response they were supposed to. That's not a personal failure. It's a mismatch between the tools you were given and the terrain you're actually navigating. The 5 masteries I'm about to share are not about becoming a different person. They're about updating your tools. About understanding the psychological dynamics that are actually at play in your relationship and responding to them in ways that are effective, not just instinctive. Let's begin. Mastery 1. Emotional regulation under disrespect. The first mastery is the one that makes all the others possible. Emotional regulation under disrespect. I know that phrase might sound clinical, but I want you to sit with what it actually means, because it is the single most transformative shift I have ever witnessed in a parent-child dynamic. Here is what happens neurologically when your adult child is disrespectful toward you. Your nervous system registers it as a threat, not just an emotional slight, but something deeper, something primal. Your cortisol spikes. Your heart rate climbs. And within seconds, you are in a reactive state. You either pull back, go quiet, go small, absorb it, or you push forward, defend yourself, escalate, demand acknowledgement. And here is what your adult child's nervous system reads in both of those responses. I have control here. Not consciously. They're not sitting there thinking, I have power over my parent. But at the level of nervous system, at the level of ingrained relational pattern, the message is landing. My behavior produces a predictable reaction. That reaction confirms the dynamic. Now here is the alternative. What if you didn't react? Not because you weren't hurt, you were. Not because it was acceptable, it wasn't. But because you made a deliberate choice to hold your response until you decided it was the right moment to deliver it. I call this the 60-second window. 60 seconds. That's approximately how long it takes for the initial cortisol surge to begin to settle, for the part of your brain responsible for considered judgment to come back online. 60 seconds between the disrespect and your response is the difference between reacting and deciding. In that window, there is a practice I recommend called the witness stance. You step slightly outside yourself, not to dissociate, not to suppress, but to observe. I notice I'm angry right now. I notice that what just happened felt diminishing. I notice that I want to react. And then you make a choice about what comes next. This is not weakness. I want to be very clear about that. Staying regulated under provocation is one of the most demanding psychological tasks a human being can perform. It requires genuine strength. And when you do it, when you remain composed and considered while someone around you is being unkind, you change the room. The parent who doesn't flinch commands a different kind of presence than the parent who pleads for things to be different. And that presence is the foundation on which everything else we're about to discuss gets built. Mastery 2. The language of non-negotiable dignity. Most parents, when faced with disrespect from an adult child, do one of two things. They go silent. They absorb it, move on, and tell themselves it's not worth making a scene. And their adult child registers this as, that behavior had no consequence. It is therefore acceptable. Or they escalate. They express their hurt loudly. They argue. They demand an apology. They revisit old grievances. And their adult child registers this as, my parent is emotionally unstable when I push. This confirms that I need to manage them from a distance. Neither response produces the outcome you want. There is a third option. A third register of communication that most parents have never been taught, because frankly, nobody taught it to their parents either. I call it calm declaration. And it operates on a framework I want to share with you. Name it, claim it, frame it. Name it means you acknowledge what happened, clearly, without drama. What just happened in this conversation wasn't respectful. Notice what that sentence does and doesn't do. It doesn't attack your child's character. It doesn't say, you are disrespectful. It describes a behavior in a moment. That is far less likely to trigger defensiveness and far more likely to land. Claim it means you state your position as a fact, not a request. I don't continue conversations that have that tone. Not, I'd prefer if you didn't. Not, it would mean a lot to me if you could. A statement of how you operate. Period. No permission sought. Frame it means you leave a door open, but you control the door. When you're ready to speak differently, I'm here. That sequence, name it, claim it, frame it, takes approximately 15 seconds to deliver. And then you follow through. You end the call. You leave the room. You do not re-engage until the tone shifts. Now, I want to name the failure modes, because they are extremely common. The first is apologizing immediately after. You say the 3 sentences, and then, in the silence that follows, your discomfort makes you retreat. I don't mean to make a big deal of this, the moment you do that, you have undone everything. The boundary was real for 8 seconds. That is not long enough to matter. The second failure mode is softening with humor. Well, you know me. I'm just an old softy who needs... No. Not now. Humor has its place in relationships. This is not that moment. The third is re-engaging before the tone has changed. Your child responds with something that's not quite disrespectful, but isn't respectful either. It's neutral, flat, slightly annoyed. And because the storm seems to have passed, you re-enter the conversation. And within 5 minutes, you're back where you started. The language of non-negotiable dignity only works when it is actually non-negotiable. Dignity is not demanded. It is demonstrated and then expected. When you speak from it consistently enough, your adult child begins, slowly, perhaps begrudgingly, to understand that this is who you are now, and who you are does not adjust downward. Mastery 3. Releasing the guilt leverage point. This mastery is the one that requires the most honesty. And I ask you to stay with me through it, because I promise I am saying it from a place of complete compassion. For many parents who experience ongoing disrespect from adult children, there is a mechanism operating beneath the surface that makes the disrespect sustainable. That mechanism is guilt. Guilt is one of the most powerful psychological levers in a family system. And in many of the families I've worked with over the years, adult children, again, not always consciously, have learned that guilt is reliable. If I make mom feel like she's been an inadequate mother, she adjusts her behavior. If I make dad feel like he owes me something, he stops pushing back. If I communicate disappointment convincingly enough, the rules change. Now, before you feel defensive on your own behalf, let me say something important. This did not happen because you are weak, and it did not happen because your child is manipulative in some predatory sense. It happened because you love them. You love them so much that the possibility of having hurt them, of having failed them in some way, is genuinely intolerable to you. And they learned over time that that love could be accessed through a particular kind of pressure. This is what I call an enabling cycle. It does not require bad intentions from anyone. It requires only consistency. And it can be interrupted. The work of releasing the guilt leverage point begins with something deceptively simple: identifying your specific guilt triggers. Not guilt in general. Your specific ones. Is it the fear that you weren't present enough during their childhood? The worry that you favored one sibling? The anxiety that your health or financial situation is a burden? The cultural narrative, perhaps deeply internalized, that a good parent absorbs whatever their child brings. Once you know your specific triggers, you can begin building what I think of as considered responses to each one. Not defensive responses. Not dismissive ones. Considered ones. I hear that you felt that way. I'm willing to talk about our history with care and honesty, but I'm not willing to have that conversation in a tone that doesn't respect both of us. What you are doing, in that sentence, is separating two things that have been fused: love and compliance. You can love your child completely, with your whole heart, and still not accept the way they are speaking to you. Those are not in conflict. In fact, accepting disrespect has never been an act of love. It has been an act of fear. Fear of losing them. Fear of being wrong. Fear of the painful silence that might follow. And here is what I have seen, time and again, in families who do this work. The day a parent becomes genuinely, quietly, unmanipulable, the day they stop taking the bait of guilt with a kind of calm that makes clear they have done their own inner work, is the day the dynamic begins, almost invisibly, to shift. Not because the adult child gives in, not because there's a tearful reconciliation, but because the system has lost its mechanism. The lever no longer moves anything. And in that absence, something new has to grow. Mastery 4. Presence without need. I want to talk about something that few people in your life will ever say to you directly, because it requires a kind of honesty that feels unkind. But after 40 years, I've learned that the kindest thing I can do is say the true thing. Adult children can sense, with extraordinary accuracy, when a parent's emotional survival depends on their approval. Not always consciously, but at the level of lived experience, they feel it. The way a call from you carries a kind of weight that a call from a friend doesn't. The way a visit, no matter how pleasant, has an undercurrent of need that makes them feel slightly responsible for your happiness. The way disagreeing with you produces a guilt that feels disproportionate because deep down, they sense that you have built something fragile around their presence in your life, and they are afraid of what happens if it breaks. Now, I want to be unambiguous about something. Wanting connection with your adult children is not only healthy, it is beautiful. It speaks to the depth of your love and the richness of what you built together. I am not telling you to want less. What I am addressing is something different. It is the state of needing them, needing their approval, their attention, their presence, as the primary source of emotional meaning in your life. Because that need, however understandable, however earned, creates a power imbalance that adult children respond to, not with tenderness, but often with resentment. This is not a character flaw in them. It is a psychological reality. When someone else's emotional survival rests on you, you do not feel love, you feel pressure. And pressure over time generates the impulse to escape it. The developmental psychologist Erik Erikson described the central task of late life as the movement from despair to integrity, the journey toward a self that has made peace with its own story. A self that does not require external validation in order to feel whole. A self that can look at its life and say, "This was real. This mattered. I am enough, not because my children confirm it, but because I know it." Arriving at that self is not just a spiritual task. It is, I would argue, the most strategic relational move available to you. The parent who has built a life, who has friendships, purpose, physical vitality, creative engagement, interests that exist entirely outside the parental role, is not a parent who needs less. They are a parent who carries less. And that lightness is attractive. It is the thing that makes adult children want to call rather than feel obligated to. I think of it as the full cup principle. You cannot receive respect, warmth, or genuine connection from someone whose presence you are secretly desperate for. The desperation distorts everything. But when you arrive at your relationship with your adult child from a place of fullness, when you genuinely have a life, when their call is a pleasure rather than a lifeline, you shift the entire relational gravity. The parent who has a life is the parent who gets called back. Mastery 5. Strategic consistency over emotional campaigns. I want to ask you something. How many times have you had the conversation? The one where you told your adult child how their behavior makes you feel. Where you were honest and vulnerable and perhaps more open than felt comfortable. Where you laid out, clearly, that things needed to change. And how much did it change? For most parents I work with, the answer is, for a little while. A few days, maybe a week. Some softness, some effort. And then, gradually, the old patterns reasserted themselves. And you were left not only with the original hurt, but with a new layer. The hurt of having been vulnerable and having it amount to nothing. Here is why that happens. Conversations register as events. They do not register as new realities. Your adult child hears you on some level. They may even feel genuine remorse in the moment. But their nervous system, the part of them that runs on habit and pattern and unconscious expectation, does not update based on a single conversation, however meaningful. It updates based on repeated, consistent, consequence-backed experience over time. This is what I call behavioral signaling. And it is the mechanism through which lasting change actually happens in relationships. Behavioral signaling has a specific time horizon. In my clinical experience, it typically takes a minimum of 90 days of consistent behavior, on your part, for an adult child's nervous system to register that a new reality is actually in effect. Not a mood, not a phase, a permanent change. What does consistency look like across 90 days? It is built on 3 pillars. The first is same response every time. When disrespect appears, whatever form it takes for you, it meets the same calm, non-engaged response. Not escalation. Not withdrawal followed by re-engagement. The same response. Every time. Without exception. The moment you make an exception because you're tired, or because it's a holiday, or because you just want things to be normal for one afternoon, you have partially reset the clock. Your adult child's nervous system has received one more piece of evidence that the old pattern is still available. The second pillar is no retroactive processing. This is a difficult one, because the impulse to relitigate is powerful and understandable. But bringing up incidents from 3 weeks ago, from 6 months ago, from childhood, it pulls the conversation into territory where both of you are operating on memory and emotion rather than present behavior. Address what is happening now. Let history stay in its place. The third pillar, and this one is frequently overlooked, is visible, positive reinforcement. When your adult child speaks to you with respect, name it. Warmly, without irony, without finally. Simply, I love talking with you like this. Or, this is the kind of conversation I look forward to. You are doing two things at once. You are reinforcing the behavior you want to see more of, and you are giving your adult child a clear signal that this is the relationship that's available. Not punishment when they get it wrong, invisibility. Warmth when they get it right, visibility. Now, I want to prepare you for something that will almost certainly happen if you implement these 5 masteries seriously. There will be a moment, probably somewhere between weeks 2 and 6, when things get worse before they get better. Your adult child, who is used to a certain relational system, will encounter a version of you that no longer behaves according to the old rules. And their nervous system will push back. They may escalate. They may withdraw dramatically. They may accuse you of being cold, distant, changed in some negative way. They may say things designed to trigger guilt because guilt was how the old system was maintained. This is not a sign that you are failing. This is what I call the test phase. It is the system fighting to restore the equilibrium it knows. And the only thing that moves you through the test phase is the same thing that got you there: consistency. Change does not happen when you make a speech. It happens when you become unpredictably consistent. When your adult child begins to realize, at a cellular level, that the person who used to be available for a certain kind of dynamic simply isn't anymore. That something has genuinely shifted. And that the relationship that is available, the warm, dignified, full-cup relationship you've been building, is actually worth showing up for. Let me bring these 5 things together because they are not a checklist. They are a system. Emotional regulation, Mastery 1, is the foundation. Without it, the other 4 are inaccessible. You cannot speak with dignity when you are flooded. You cannot release guilt when you are reactive. You cannot embody fullness when you are in pain. You cannot maintain consistency when every incident feels like a crisis. The language of non-negotiable dignity, Mastery 2, is how regulation expresses itself in relationship. It is the vehicle through which the inner shift becomes visible. Releasing the guilt leverage point, Mastery 3, removes the mechanism that has been quietly sabotaging your efforts. You can do everything right, and if guilt remains a functional lever, the dynamic will keep reasserting itself. Presence without need, Mastery 4, changes the fundamental gravity of the relationship. It moves you from a position of emotional dependency to one of genuine wholeness. And wholeness, I have found, is the thing that adult children ultimately respond to. And consistency, Mastery 5, is what makes all of it real. Not a performance, not a phase. A permanent, embodied shift in who you are in this relationship. I want to acknowledge something before we close. What I've described today is genuinely hard work. It asks something of you that you were probably never taught in a generation that was told the way to show love was to endure and give without limit. To do this work, to regulate, to speak firmly, to release guilt, to build a full life, to stay consistent through the test phase, requires a kind of courage that does not always look like courage from the outside. But I have seen it. I have sat with parents in their late 60s and 70s who were convinced that things would never change, who did this work, quietly, incrementally, without drama, and who came back months later to describe a relationship they had almost given up on. Not perfect, not without complexity, but different. Fundamentally, lastingly different. And the change never started with their child. It started with them. I want to leave you with something. The title of this video promises that if you master these 5 things, your children will never disrespect you again. And I believe that is true, not because you will have forced compliance, not because you will have won an argument, but because you will have become someone different. You will have become the version of yourself that knows who they are. That doesn't flinch. That doesn't beg. That loves fully and still, somehow, holds their ground. The parent who masters these 5 things doesn't win a confrontation. They change a room just by walking into it. That's who you've always been capable of being. This work is just the path back to yourself. If today's video spoke to something you've been carrying, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these 5 masteries feels most relevant to where you are right now? Or which one feels most difficult, because that's usually the one that matters most. If you found value in this, please share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe to Strong Elderly Life for a new video every week, because this journey, at every age, is still worth taking. I'll see you in the next one.